Divorce me. Now that I'm cured, I want to start over with my life.
My husband, Aiden, recovered from his illness thanks to the organ I donated. Before the transplant, he had pleaded desperately, but after the surgery, he didn't even thank me. Instead, he treated me terribly and eventually demanded a divorce. As I stood there, stunned by his sudden declaration, he looked at me with disdain and hurled insults.
I don't need some old, sick wife dragging me down as I restart my life.
My name is Julie. I'm 31 years old, balancing homemaking with a job. At the age of 28, I married Aiden, who is 3 years my senior, and shortly thereafter, we welcomed our daughter, Amy, into the world. After my maternity leave, I returned to work, juggling the responsibilities of my job, household chores, and childcare, while enjoying a harmonious life with Aiden and Amy. However, things took a turn when Aiden began frequently feeling unwell, and a visit to the hospital revealed a shocking diagnosis: end-stage kidney failure. He had delayed seeing a doctor, citing his busy work schedule, which led to the late diagnosis. As a result, he became unable to work and had to quit his job. Until a donor could be found for a kidney transplant, he needed dialysis 3 times a week. The suddenness of it all left me feeling extremely anxious, but with him unable to work, I knew I had to step up. Our daughter Amy was 3, in a lively and growing stage, and I couldn't rely solely on the benefits from Aiden's disability pension and retirement compensation. However, taking care of Aiden's health while looking after our young daughter only increased my burden. During that time, my mother-in-law, Carol, who was concerned about us, suggested that we move in with her. She had already lost her husband and was living alone in her home, and she and I had a good relationship. I thought Aiden would find it comforting to have his mother nearby, so I gratefully accepted the offer. We moved out of our current home, and Aiden, Amy, and I started a new life living with Carol. Carol not only cared deeply for her son Aiden, but she also looked out for me and my daughter. While I was at work, she would help with the housework and take care of picking up and dropping off Amy at daycare. Although Aiden had taken on the role of a stay-at-home dad after quitting his job, he struggled with the unfamiliar responsibilities of running a household. Plus, his health was unpredictable, varying from day to day. Additionally, each dialysis session took about 4 to 5 hours, and during those times when he was at the hospital, Carol stepped in to manage the household chores and childcare, which I greatly appreciated. However, it seemed Aiden realized that with his mother handling most of the housework, he didn't need to do much himself. Gradually, he started leaving more of the house duties to Carol and me. As he recovered, he began going out more frequently, even on non-dialysis days when he felt well. I once asked him where he was going and what he was doing, but he only replied irritably,
It's just to clear my head. What's wrong with that?
Considering his illness, I couldn't press him further. Perhaps emboldened by my reluctance to push back, his outings became more frequent over time. After living this way for a while, a donor was finally found, allowing Aiden to have a kidney transplant. I was his donor. During a checkup at the hospital, it was determined that my kidney function was normal and that I was in good physical and mental health, making me a suitable match for the donation. With Aiden's desperate pleas,
Please, Julie.
I agreed to be his donor, offering him one of my kidneys. After the transplant surgery, he gradually regained his health through physical therapy. Unfortunately, as the donor, I developed proteinuria during my recovery and had to spend several days in the hospital after the procedure. I had been informed of the risks beforehand by the doctors about donating one of my 2 kidneys. Though I never thought that I'd actually experience some side effects, I almost panicked when they appeared. The doctor warned me that proteinuria could worsen, potentially leading to heart disease, so I needed to avoid consuming too much protein. After a few days in the hospital, I was discharged, and I discussed it with Carol. We decided that I would have a separate, low-protein diet for each meal. I also made efforts to reduce salt intake, ensure I got enough sleep, and stick to these lifestyle changes, even as I went back to work, carrying a constant sense of anxiety. Since the transplant, I've also had fluctuations in my health, but I've managed to keep working as I used to. A few days after I was discharged, Aiden came home from the hospital. When our family sat down together for dinner for the first time after his discharge, he suddenly said,
Why are you the only one eating something different? You tell Amy not to be picky, yet you avoid what you don't like. You're so selfish.
He blamed me and then began to insult me about my post-surgery health issues and appearance. It was true that I often felt fatigued, suffered from headaches, and sometimes couldn't move much. Additionally, I had started experiencing swelling in my hands, feet, and face. However, Aiden had similar symptoms before, and I couldn't understand how he could insult me while ignoring his own past. Carol tried to calm him down and explained my condition, but he didn't listen. Instead, he shouted,
Stay away from me! I might catch your disease!
Amy, who had been quietly eating her dinner, looked up at her suddenly yelling father with frightened eyes. Even though she was still young, she could sense the tension in the air. She remained silent during the meal, meticulously using her fork and knife, as she was still mastering their use. As Aiden's voice grew louder, she became still, and after a brief glance at him, her gaze fell and her expression teetering on the brink of tears. Carol rose and embraced her gently. I knew that if I argued back, it would only lead to more shouting from him, and I feared it might finally make Amy cry. Therefore, I stayed silent, waiting until she finished her meal. It was incomprehensible to me that he could utter such harsh words, particularly when the entire situation stemmed from my act of donating a kidney to him. After dinner, I attempted to discuss matters with Aiden while Amy stayed with Carol, but his only response was,
You disgust me! Stay away from me, you sickly thing!
Even when Carol urged him to spend more time at home, he refused to listen. It seemed like Aiden had completely forgotten that he was only able to live a healthy life because I had donated my kidney to him. Whenever we saw each other, instead of having a normal conversation, he would just hurl insults at me. It was clear that he couldn't stand living under the same roof with me. Amy would ask me with a trembling voice,
Mommy, what's wrong with Daddy? He's so scary.
Even at her young age, she seemed to realize that something was wrong with her father's behavior, and she gradually started avoiding him. Aiden, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice and tried to interact with Amy when he was home. Yet every time, she clung to me, shaking, and I was at a loss for a solution. All that was within my power was to offer her comfort. Reflecting on the past, he had pleaded with me to be his donor before the transplant, but after the operation, he never expressed his gratitude. Was Aiden always this arrogant? When I remembered our happy days as newlyweds or when Amy had just been born, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmingly sad. Our relationship never improved, and I continued working while trying to maintain my new lifestyle. After several tests at the hospital, the doctors told me that my proteinuria was gradually improving and that it hadn't worsened, which was a huge relief. One day, I took a day off from work to visit the hospital and returned home just a short time ago. Subsequently, Carol went out shopping, so I thought about picking up Amy from daycare later. As I sat alone, taking a moment to catch my breath, Aiden came back from one of his usual outings. He looked at me with his usual disdain, and I assumed he would ignore me again. Instead, he said something completely unexpected.
Divorce me.
he said bluntly. What? What's gotten into you all of a sudden?
I'm cured now, and I want to start over. I don't need an old, sick wife dragging me down as I restart my life.
He spoke clearly as he demanded a divorce, leaving me bewildered by his sudden declaration. Though I was surprised, I didn't feel as shocked as I might have expected. After all, I'd already grown distrustful of him when he stopped helping around the house, neglected childcare, and started going out more often. Moreover, when my own illness was discovered, his terrible attitude only made things worse. Rather than expressing concern, he asked me to keep my distance, and the love I once felt for him had already dissipated. The hurtful words he just threw at me were more than enough to solidify my feelings. Fine. I agreed to the divorce and signed the papers he had brought. While I felt a sense of bitterness, I knew there was no other choice. I had no confidence that staying with him could repair our relationship or make things work again.
Well then, get out of this house. I'm the one inheriting it.
Aiden, satisfied as he looked over my signed name on the divorce papers, said those words. He even added,
Amy is my blood, she's my precious daughter, so you can leave on your own.
His arrogance was unbearable. The mention of Amy pushed me past my breaking point. How could he say such things when he had hardly cared for her and spent most of his time out of the house? Don't make decisions on your own. Amy is afraid of you. There's no way I can leave her with someone like you.
Shut up! Just get out right now!
Even when I argued back, he refused to listen and kept trying to kick me out. I couldn't back down when it came to our daughter. The thought of Amy being raised with only one parent was painful, but if I was leaving, I was determined to take her with me. While we were locked in a standoff, Carol, who had been out shopping, returned home.
What's going on with you two? What happened? I could hear you two from outside.
She asked, sounding concerned. Behind her stood a young woman I had never seen before. Carol, who is she? I asked, and she explained. When Carol came home from shopping, she noticed a woman standing near the entrance, holding something, and approached her out of curiosity. The woman claimed to be Aiden's acquaintance. Thinking it would be rude to leave her outside, Carol had invited her inside if she had business to attend to. The woman looked to be in her early to mid-20s, elegantly dressed. I'd never heard of Aiden having such an acquaintance. I cast a suspicious glance his way, and as he gazed at the woman, his face turned ashen.
What are you doing inside the house? I told you to wait outside.
Oh, but your mother invited me in. You're getting a divorce, aren't you? I thought I'd see your sick wife's face before it's official.
Her attitude was in stark contrast to Aiden's panic. She looked at me with a smug, victorious smile, her demeanor oozing confidence. From Aiden's guilty behavior, it became clear that something inappropriate was going on between them. A thought started to take shape in my mind. Could this be? Maybe it's you who should be leaving this house, I said to Aiden in a surprisingly steady voice. I'm not letting Amy stay with someone like you. If you don't want to face legal trouble, take this and get out now. Go stay with your new lady friend. I shoved the divorce papers into Aiden's hands as I shouted. The mention of a legal threat seemed to get through to him. He glared at me with resentment, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out of the house. As I watched him leave, the young woman smirked down at me, then turned and followed him out the door. After their departure, a bewildered Carol turned to me and inquired,
Julie, what's happening?
I explained to her about the divorce and the young woman who had just left. That woman was Aiden's affair partner. Looking back at his behavior, it all made sense. Most likely, those outings he had been taking were to meet her. When Carol first learned about her son's affair, she lamented his infidelity and apologized to me. After leaving the house, Aiden moved in with his mistress. Amy was saddened by the sudden absence of her father, but perhaps she sensed what was happening. She never cried. Perhaps due to everything she'd been through with our illnesses, Amy grew up to be a very considerate child who rarely acted out. Although it made things easier, it was a little heartbreaking. Considering my own health, I continued living with Amy and Carol in the family home even after divorcing Aiden. A year after the divorce, when my proteinuria had improved and our lives had regained some stability, I decided it was time. I planned to leave my job and move back to my distant hometown with Amy. When I shared this with Carol, she tried to dissuade me. She seemed to feel a sense of responsibility for Aiden's actions. Persuaded by her, I agreed to stay until I had saved enough money to make the move comfortably. Though Carol showed so much care for me and Amy, I couldn't understand how her son Aiden had become such a selfish person. I even wondered if he might have some sort of mental or neurological condition. But I quickly dismissed the thought. I didn't have the energy to concern myself with someone like him any longer. One evening, after coming home from work, I noticed a voicemail on my phone. The caller was none other than my ex-husband, Aiden. His desperate message went,
Julie, help me. I've been diagnosed with a lung condition. They say surgery is my only option, and I need a donor for a transplant. Please be my donor again and give me part of your lung.
I was utterly taken aback by his self-centered request and immediately deleted the message. We were no longer married, no longer family, and I had no obligation to respond to his outrageous demand. Even if we were still married, I would never consider donating to him again. Nevertheless, Aiden persisted in calling often, which I consistently ignored. Each time, he left a voicemail and he said,
I broke up with my girlfriend, so I'll take you back. We can get remarried.
His tone was condescending. Of course, I ignored that message as well. A few days later, Aiden showed up at the house when Carol was out, clearly frustrated by my continued refusal to answer his calls. He tried to intimidate me, saying,
You've been ignoring me for too long. I know that as long as I have Amy, you'll do what I say. I'm taking her with me.
He glared at me while Amy, trembling, clung to my arms. I gripped her firmly and returned his gaze, undaunted. I have custody of her. Trying to take her away by force makes you nothing more than a kidnapper. How could you just barge in here and threaten us like this? You're so selfish.
She's my biological daughter. How could that be kidnapping? Just hand over Amy now. If you don't want that, then give me a lung.
Seeing the wild look in his eyes, I felt genuine fear. Trying to stay calm, I called the police. I couldn't get much across on the phone, but his loud shouting was enough to bring the police quickly. Multiple officers arrived, and Aiden was taken away, still shouting,
Be my donor.
And
Give me Amy.
in the end, he was escorted away, and a restraining order was placed against him, preventing him from coming near me. Around that time, I had finally saved enough money to move out of Carol's home, and I had been planning our departure soon. However, before I left, I decided it was time to ensure Aiden faced the consequences of his actions. With evidence of his affair that I had previously gathered through a private investigator, I consulted with an attorney and filed a claim for alimony. Aiden probably thought that he couldn't be sued since he had left peacefully on the day of our divorce, but I had never said I wouldn't pursue alimony. I had simply been waiting until I had enough solid evidence to guarantee my claim. Later, Aiden tried calling me multiple times, but I never answered. I could easily imagine how furious he was, but I didn't see any reason to engage with him anymore. As expected, he left another voicemail, protesting the alimony payments and demanding that I become a lung donor for him. Naturally, I ignored his demands and blocked his contact number. After that, I found a place to rent at a reasonable distance from Carol's home, and Amy and I moved in together. Carol adored Amy, and I intended to continue our relationship with her. One day, during one of her visits to our new home, Carol shared some news about Aiden. Unable to work because of the lung condition, he was struggling to keep up with the alimony payments while anxiously waiting for his turn on the transplant list. The young woman who once laughed at me alongside Aiden had packed her bags and left the very next day after he asked her to be a donor. However, I had already obtained her address through the private investigator, and she quickly agreed to the alimony demands when faced with the threat of a lawsuit, so she no longer mattered to me. Since the day Aiden showed up at our home, I have not allowed him to see Amy. No matter his situation, he was the kind of man who attempted to take our child without paying child support. There is no reason for Amy to be in contact with him. While I plan to maintain my connection with Carol, I have no intention of ever interacting with Aiden again. Moving forward, I anticipate a tranquil life, observing Amy's growth with Carol, and valuing the serene and joyful days to come.